I'm Heath Lambert, and you're listening to a bonus episode of What Happened at First Baptist Church. This bonus episode is for ministry staff, pastors, leaders, and anyone else wanting to take a deeper look at the revitalization of First Baptist Church to learn something about the mistakes and the successes we made during the changes at our church. Whether you are leading a ministry or participating in a ministry, you must know that your ministry will have to change or your ministry will die. Things change. Things have to change. If they don't change, you will die. The hard part is deciding what to change. Nobody, no leader can change everything. No ministry can sustain complete change. And so you've got difficult decisions to make. These choices are really hard when change has not happened for decades. And it's even harder when you consider the terrible tension of transition. Let me explain the terrible tension of transition that every leader has to contend with. That terrible tension of transition happens when your church needs to change in order to reach new people. But you have to love the people you've got before you can reach the people you don't have. This is where the terrible tension of transition comes in. You have to change enough to be relevant to the outsiders you need to reach without changing so much that you alienate the insiders who are paying the current bills. Listen, it's easy to do the extremes. It's easy to come in with a jackhammer and blow everything up and lose all the people you've got. It's also easy to not change anything and make everybody happy until nobody comes to the church anymore because the church just dies. Balancing the tension is really, really hard and is the test of every leader in any ministry transition. And all of that tension is magnified when the clock is ticking. Change is not just going to happen to your church, but change is also personal. It's personal with me. It's personal with you. God is doing things in our lives. He's moving us to new places. He is taking us in directions we didn't anticipate. I never wanted to be a mega church pastor. I only ever wanted to be faithful. And that faithfulness started out as wanting to be faithful in my little small church where I got saved. In just a matter of a decade and a half, I found myself needing to be faithful at a large, influential church. You need to prepare yourself for this. Change is not just going to happen to your ministry, it's going to happen to you. But it definitely will happen in your ministry. And as I adjusted to life at First Baptist Church, I came to see the really striking and truly overwhelming problems that the church was facing. My instinct as a leader is to be a slow, subtle person. I like slow, subtle changes over the long haul. The problem is, when I got to First Baptist Church, we were running out of money and we were running out of time. We did not have the luxury of slowness and of subtlety. Your situation is going to be different than mine, but I want to talk about 8 principles on leading change while there's still time, before it's too late, that I think you can apply to your ministry and that we applied to First Baptist Church. Here's the first thing you need to do. You need to plan for change. How do you do that? Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to pray and ask God's favor. God has to be in this change or it will not work. If God isn't the leader and the initiator of change, nothing is going to be effective. In Psalm 127, verse 1, it says, "Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain." One of the greatest things that happened in my life in the revitalization of First Baptist Church was that the Lord taught me to pray more than I ever had. In the moments and the hours and the months and the years of weakness, I found myself on my knees and on my face begging God, if you don't come through for me, if you don't come through for us, this isn't going to work, and it shouldn't work. It can't work. And so if you are going to plan for change, you need to pray for change. You also need to seek counsel. I have deeply trusted staff members who are excellent at their jobs who could help with this. I also had faithful lay leaders who were wise and loving. And every time I called, they'd pick up the phone. Every time I asked for a meeting, they would get together, and they had a lot of helpful input. I also created what I called the brain trust. This was people I'd come to know over the years. Some of them had led through similar situations. Others of them were men I knew to just be effective leaders. They were people like Bob Russell from Southeast Christian Church, people like Warren Bird, who wrote Next, people like Al Mohler at Southern Seminary, Jimmy Scroggins at Family Church, Clint Presley at Hickory Grove Baptist Church. And when I talked to these guys, I'd say, hey, listen, I want you to be on this brain trust as I try to overcome these problems. And here's what that means. When I call you, I need you to pick up the phone and help me. And those people and others like them were always so faithful to pick up the phone and help me think through the challenges. Whatever you do, you are going to have to get counsel. I want to talk for a few minutes about the uncertainty of all of this. So when you're sitting in the chair and you're trying to lead change, you're trying to move forward, I know you had moments, I certainly had moments, I had months, maybe years, depending on how you count, where I wasn't sure if this is going to work. Like, I mean, here's my idea, but I don't know. They're not a rule book, and they're not a guarantee that this is going to work. I mean, this thing could blow up. And in fact, almost every plan that we had wound up having to be changed or tweaked, if not abandoned in some significant way. So to the guy sitting out there who's going, I gotta do something different, but I don't know. They're not a guarantee. They're not a rule book. How would you tell that guy to process the uncertainty of the decisions he's making?
Well, none of us can actually see the future. So there's always uncertainty in every decision. And even when you look at somebody like you, Heath, and First Baptist Jacksonville and say, wow, Heath, you've pulled it off. You're on the other side. Or you can say the same thing about me and Family Church in West Palm Beach. But the truth is, it's still a church, and it's all extremely fragile. And something could change today or tomorrow that you and I haven't foreseen that could completely change the playing field for us and our leadership and our churches. And so I just think this is why we can talk about strategy and leadership and decision making. I love to talk about those things. But the truth is, the Spirit of God blows where he wills, and you can't always define why he's blowing here and not blowing there. And there are some things that turn out to be successful that I think are kind of like, for whatever reason, God chose to bless that and allow that to flourish. And then there's some other things that seem to be really good ideas that God does not bless or choose to make them flourish. And so I just think living with the uncertainty, I mean, Jesus said it, didn't he? He said, look, don't worry about tomorrow. You got enough problems today. So I think we shouldn't worry when we're in a bad spot too much and trust the Lord. And we also probably shouldn't break our arms patting ourselves on the back when good things are happening, because you don't know what tomorrow is going to bring.
Proverbs chapter 11, verse 14 says, when there is no guidance, a people falls, but in an abundance of counselors, there is safety. You can't figure this out on your own. You need help. So you got to plan for change. Second, you got to prepare your people. You have to create the expectation that change is necessary with your folks. And the first staff meeting I led, I stood in front of our people behind a replica of the Titanic, and I explained the sinking of the Titanic. I explained the dilemma that the best crew on the best ship was now at the bottom of the sea. And the reason that was the case is because they would not and did not change. And I said, we are not going to be the Titanic. We are not going to wind up at the bottom of the sea. We are going to change this. And so I created a very clear expectation for change on the part of our staff. I pled with them that fall back in 2017. Everything's going to change. Please don't assume this won't be in your area. It's easy for people who know things are going badly to be excited when they hear about change, and they think, oh, this is going to be wonderful, and he's going to change everything except my area. And I wanted people to know, no, everything has to change. We're in comprehensive ministry failure. So we've got to do comprehensive ministry change before it's too late. So I started with our staff, but I also continued that preparation of the people with our lay leaders. That first year, I asked all of our deacons to read The Autopsy of a Deceased Church by Tom Rainer. I wanted them to hear another leader besides me say, here's what goes wrong in a church that is dying. And then we met at our deacons retreat for me to talk about the aggressive action we were going to need to take to keep the church from being at the bottom of the drink. Ultimately, I communicated all of this information in messages to our congregation regularly to help them be informed about the shape we were in. So you need to prepare your people that change is on the way. Next, you need to persuade your people. You can't just scare the daylights out of them. You have to make a case for change. Your people have to be persuaded that what they're currently doing won't work and what you're proposing will work. This is about preparation on your part. You have to be aware of the true facts about the situation your church is in. You have to be more expert about the situation your church is facing than anybody else is. When people ask you a question, you have to be able to fire off the answer. This is also about your trustworthiness as a leader. You must tell the truth. Believe me, people are going to accuse you of being a liar. We're going to talk about that in a different episode. Those accusations notwithstanding, you must be before God a trustworthy, dependable person who has the trust of your people when you start to speak. And then this is also about communication. This is about your ability clearly and consistently to make the case. If you can't persuade people to join you, you are finished. And it's worse than that. Because if you have a vision for change, if you have a vision to inject new life in your congregation and you're finished and those changes don't happen and the church dies, then the church is finished. And so you must persuade your people. This is the Lord's work, and we can trust in Him. We can start small. We can persuade in smaller circles and grow out in concentric circles of influence. So you got to persuade your people, but what are you persuading them to do? What kinds of changes are you going to make? Well, that leads to the next principle. Your church might need to change its principles. This is the issue of faithfulness versus faithlessness. Faithlessness in a ministry must be addressed and repented of. If your church has stepped away from Jesus, from the Bible, and from the faith for all once delivered to the saints, you've got to repent of that and return your church to biblical fidelity. As I said in the last episode, in God's kindness, this was not the problem at First Baptist Church that I needed to face, and I am profoundly thankful for the many faithful leaders and preachers who preceded me at First Baptist Church who protected our church from biblical faithlessness. But your church also might need to change its priorities. A church that is dying has lost its focus and has lost its true love, regardless of how strongly they confess their commitment to the Scriptures. I want to be really careful here. The people at First Baptist Church love Jesus Christ, and they love His gospel. I don't think the core of my folks at First Baptist ever took their eyes off Jesus. But it's those core folks who did tell me in countless interviews I've had with church members across the years, they're the ones who told me that our church got confused. They got ingrown. They got self-focused. They got boastful, and they got braggadocious. There is a kind of love for Jesus that grows out and shares the faith and is evangelistic. And there's a kind of love for Jesus that bends in and goes inward and gets self-focused. And this did become a problem at First Baptist for a season. I began to address this problem very early. In 2018, I launched the first evangelism program that the church had had since 2007. We called it Reach. That's really important because we come today to talk about not just Matthew, but to talk about not just Matthew's portrait of Jesus and to see a precursor of Jesus a man named John the Baptist pointing us to Jesus, not just to talk about those things, but to talk about our initiative to reach the city of Jacksonville with the love of Jesus Christ. We've been talking about this for months. We've been saying that today would be the day we would talk about it. We've been training Sunday school teachers and lay leaders. We have been doing behind the scenes work, laying all the groundwork for this, and now we're here today to talk about what it's actually going to mean.
It was a relational evangelism strategy that sought to replace the door-to-door cold call evangelism strategy that the church had been familiar with a more relational strategy. We launched that in 2018. And in 2018, my very first Sunday morning sermon series was on the book of Jonah. And we talked about the Jonah syndrome that receives the grace of God but refuses to share the grace of God. We talked about how that was an affliction in our church of which we needed to repent.
As we've been looking together at the book of Jonah, we've been talking about a malady in the soul of Jonah. We've been talking about a sickness in his heart, a disease of spirit that I've called the Jonah syndrome. And the Jonah syndrome is a syndrome that afflicted the prophet and it afflicts us. It's a disease in our heart where we are happy to have received the grace of God, which leads to light and life, and we don't care whether other people receive that grace, which leads to light and life. We are happy to sit and be a recipient of grace from the hands of another messenger, from the mouth of someone else, but we don't view it as our responsibility to open up our mouths and share that same grace of God with other people.
Your church, if it's dying, is going to have to change its priorities because dying churches have gotten their priorities out of whack. Another principle for change is your church is going to need to change its practices and its programs. We've already talked in the last episode about the difference between principles that are unchanging and practices that must change regularly in order to fit the cultural context you're doing ministry in. Practices and programs are downstream from principles. What are the good things that your church has done in the past that worked but don't make sense anymore? You have to answer that question honestly. What are the good things that we did in the past that worked that don't make sense anymore? Let me give you a couple examples from the ministry of First Baptist Church. First of all, our greeter ministry. The greeter ministry at First Baptist Church in the 70s and 80s and 90s and into the 2000s was with suited ushers at the doors. These were good, godly, faithful men wearing coats and ties, greeting people with formal greetings and handshakes. That worked back in a day of ministry growth at First Baptist. It wasn't working in the 2020s anymore. We had to make a transition to a greeter ministry where people were wearing polo shirts and they were walking around and they had lanyards and they would meet you at the parking lot and they'd help you get to where you were going. They'd walk you from the parking garage to where you needed to take your kids to children's ministry and where the worship service was. It needed to be a more mobile, less formal ministry than it had been. The greeter ministry as it had been was wonderful and it worked, but the way we were doing it didn't make sense anymore. Another example was with our church's Passion Play. It was called the Jacksonville Passion Play. It was a remarkable full-scale Broadway production retelling the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ at Easter time. We spent hundreds of thousands of dollars each year on this production. More than that, we spent months and hundreds and thousands of man-hours on this production. The last year we did it, in 2019, I want you to hear this. First Baptist Church welcomed 30,000 people onto our campus to see the Jacksonville Passion Play. But out of all those 30,000 people, even though every service we gave a gospel invitation, every person got handed a card to receive their contact information so we could reach out to them. After welcoming 30,000 people onto our campus, we got something like 5 contacts from it. That means after hundreds of thousands of dollars, after hundreds of thousands of man hours, after rearranging the church calendar for months, we had a shot at reaching 5 people. One of the things I discovered as I came to every showing of the Jacksonville Passion Play, every showing, there would be tour buses from South Florida and Central Florida and South Georgia and Alabama, and they'd be parked up along our streets. And what I realized is we have people who are committed to their churches in other states who are getting on buses to come see our show, and then they're going to get back on those buses and go back to their churches and have nothing to do with First Baptist Church ever again. Listen, I'm not complaining. That's a remarkable investment. But First Baptist Church was dying. And we had to make a decision. The Passion Play was wonderful. It worked when it was effective. But in the day and age where we're doing ministry and we need to grow and we need to reach converts, is this working anymore? And the answer was, it was just a distraction from our main mission, and we had to step away from it. It's the same thing with the church's pastors' conference. Many of you listening to this will have been blessed for decades by the Jacksonville Pastors' Conference, but it had been in tragic decline. In 2006, the Times-Union, the local paper in Jacksonville, Florida, reported that there were 9,000 people in attendance at the Jacksonville Pastors' Conference. In 2017, we had something like 400 people in attendance. That is a remarkable decline in 11 years. I also want to be clear that those are 400 precious pastors. And if you can get 400 pastors to show up to a conference, you've done a great job. The problem was it was dreadfully expensive. We were spending just as much money on it as we were spending when we had 9,000 coming, and it was killing our people. And here's the thing. The Jacksonville Pastors Conference blew up and became popular when everybody wanted to do ministry the way we were doing it at First Baptist. And I had to reckon with the fact that in 2018, First Baptist Church had been a dying church for almost 25 years and had lost the ability to instruct pastors about how they should lead their church. And so we had to step away. It was a remarkable gift to the Christian community. It was a remarkable blessing to our church. It had been effective in the past, but it wasn't being effective anymore. These are the kinds of things that have to change. They're the kinds of practices and the kinds of programs that if you hang on to them, you will sink to the bottom of the drink with them instead of growing in your effectiveness. Another principle on leading change is that your church is going to have to change its places. This is a tough one. Our locations for ministry are not the ministry. They are the context for the ministry. But for people who love the places and who get attached to the places, it becomes very, very hard for them to make a distinction between ministry and the place where ministry happens. But those places where ministry happen have to change. Facilities get old. They get broken. They get outdated. They need to be renovated. They need to be torn down. They need to be sold. Sometimes they need to be relocated. At First Baptist Church, I proposed in 2019 a 1-block plan. We considered all sorts of plans. We considered selling everything downtown and relocating. We didn't want to do that. We considered doing ministry on multiple blocks based on a lot of prayer and on a lot of wisdom. We decided on a 1-block plan that would get us down from this unwieldy 12 blocks with multiple buildings and multiple stories to a navigable space that would be friendly to our members and friendly to our visitors. It would get us down to space that we needed. On those 12 blocks, First Baptist Church was using 1.5 million square feet. The consultants we spoke to said that a church our size needed no more than about 200 to 250,000 feet. This meant that we were using space that was about roughly 10 times the size of what we needed. It'd be like a family of 4 who lives in a home the average size of 2,500 square feet, living in a home that's 25,000 square feet. Imagine what it would take for you to have to afford a 25,000 square foot home. That's what First Baptist was trying to do. And a 1-block plan would reduce that and get us in space that we needed and space that we could maintain. Changing those places, though, is excruciating. At First Baptist, we had this massive auditorium that held so much meaning for so many people. So many people gave their life to Christ in that room. So many people were baptized in that room and watched their kids and their grandkids get baptized in that room. So many people watched Billy Graham preach and other leaders in the Southern Baptist Convention preach. Every president of the Southern Baptist Convention for decades preached in that room. Precious former pastors preached in that room. And it was excruciating to think about leaving it. It's the problem of Grandma's house. Grandma's house is not Grandma, but most of your memories of Grandma are there. And if you have to sell her house, you feel like you lose something of Grandma. How do you respond to that? Well, you have to remember the terrible tension of transition. You're going to have to make some changes to reach people that aren't there while caring for the people who still are. You're going to have to remember to be prepared. You got to think about the information that you know so that you can make the case. You've got to be persuasive and make a compelling argument. You've got to remember the recovery of principles. These places and these programs are not the gospel. They are not Jesus. They are in service of Jesus. And if faithfulness to Jesus requires changing them, then we change them. You also need to remember to love your folks. This was one of the things that I was just committed to doing. I was going to be present with our people. I was going to be present early on Sundays and late on Sundays and on Wednesdays. I was going to go to visit people and talk with them and pray with them. I was going to be available to answer their questions and address their concerns. You've got to love your folks. You also have to honor the past. I don't ever want to say anything that makes it sound like leaders in the past did bad things or the places that worked in the past were ultimately ineffective. I want to honor the good things that happened before. In fact, as an example of that, on our very last day in the main auditorium, here were the very last words I said to our congregation before the end of our service. This is our last Sunday in this incredible room that we call the main auditorium. We moved in 28 years ago in 1993. And in those 28 years, amazing things have happened. Everybody in this room, or at least most of you, whether you're watching online, whether you're listening, you have incredible memories of incredible events that happened in your life. Some of you gave your life to Jesus Christ in this room. Some of you were here when your kids did. All of us have been able to participate in, honestly, the most glorious music that is available in the history of the church, honestly. We have been able to experience some of the most significant and noteworthy preaching in the history of the Christian church, even with 3 of our very own pastors who are known far and wide as excellent expositors. Homer Lindsay, Jerry Vines, Mac Brunson preached right in this pulpit, or depending on the year, a little bit higher. But you've heard those men and many others preach exceptional sermons. I baptized 2 of my 3 kids in that great big baptistry right up there. There have been incredible things that have happened in here. If you look on YouTube and you see these packed full services from the late 90s and early 2000s, those were the pastors' conferences, where thousands of pastors from all over the country and all over the world would fill these pews and worship the Lord and hear great preaching. Amazing things have happened in this room. Your church needs to change its personnel. For me, this one was the hardest one because I went into ministry for people. I love people. I love working with people. I love helping people. I love encouraging people. And removing people from positions that they love and wanted to keep is the hardest thing I have ever done. I had to preside over hundreds of personnel changes at First Baptist Church. It was excruciating to the point of nearly killing me. I don't think it was as hard on me as it was for those who lost their jobs, but it was a brutal execution of my soul to have to make the decision about people's employment that I had to make, and not just one and not just a few, but hundreds of times. As painful as it is, you have to make these personnel changes, and I need to tell you why. You will be dealing with staff who have a different vision of the future than what the church needs to have. Declining churches must change their priorities, and you cannot have staff that are clinging to the priorities they've had in the past that have led to decline that are going to help you change to make the church more vital and more relevant going into the future. Some staff can change. In my experience, most can't. Most get tied to the old ways, the old forms, and they find it impossible to separate what the Bible teaches about ministry from the way they have accomplished ministry in the past that has proven to be ineffective. You're also dealing with staff who are blind to problems. You might remember from years ago a Febreze commercial that came out about being nose blind. Febreze gives the promise of covering up the odors that you're nose blind to. Well, there is a problem of problem blindness where you don't have to be at a church, you don't have to be at an institution for very long before you just lose the ability to see the problems that are killing the church. If you don't see problems, you don't even think to look for solutions. I've got so many examples of this from so many meetings and so many conversations, I can't even tell you. But here's one. I mentioned that we were serving in buildings that were full of black mold. We would have visitors to our campus who would leave after a few minutes because they would say, it smells like mold in here. We had one pastor who moved into his office and the window was full of black mold. And we told maintenance, we've got black mold growing in this guy's window. We need to take it out. And the former maintenance workers said, no, there's no black mold in there. But we could see it. We could smell it. We brought in people to test it and found that the black mold was off the charts. It was an unsafe place to be, but folks got problem blind. Also, you have to change your personnel because the fact of the matter is, in a declining church with declining ministries, you have personnel who have been ineffective. Employees who have served for many years, and every year their ministry has had fewer people in it than the year before, are not being effective. This is very hard because a lack of effectiveness does not mean a lack of affection. In fact, there are very ineffective employees who have a lot of affection in your heart and have a lot of affection with other people out in the church. But you can be beloved by people. You can be appreciated by people and ineffective in your work. The fact of the matter is, growing churches attract effective employees, and declining churches attract ineffective employees. And if you want to be a growing church, you are going to have to be a leader and make tough decisions that are unpopular, that nobody wants to make, and you are going to have to eliminate ineffectiveness from the ministry staff. The reality is, once you are a paid employee of a church, this is not a charity anymore. We're not giving you money as a benevolence ministry. We're giving you money to do a job, and people must be evaluated on how effectively they do their job. You also have to make these personnel changes because when the old guard looks at a new leader, there is going to be distrust that will poison relationships. This isn't the way it should be, but it's the way it is. When the new guy talks about a new direction
and the old folks like it the way it is, they're not going to just say, we disagree. Good people can disagree. We're not going to say, oh, we just have a straightforward disagreement here. No, they're going to distrust you. The relationship is going to be poisoned. They're not going to say, I don't like your ideas. They're going to say, I don't like you. They're not going to say, I don't like your plan. They're going to say, you are a bad guy. This is about distrust and a lack of love. And the reality is no ministry team can be effective with this kind of poisonous distrust. Here's another really obvious reason why you have to make these changes, is there are positions that just don't make sense anymore. The positions made sense when the church was growing. They don't make sense when the church is declining. At First Baptist Church, we had more than a dozen kitchen staff working through the week. People walking around with white hats and white coats on a kitchen staff. They were precious people, and they had jobs that once made sense. They didn't make sense anymore. At First Baptist Church, we had over 40 childcare workers that came to work every day. We were spending $300,000 a year to pay workers that were essentially functioning like a daycare organization every day. That's a remarkable ministry. Those are remarkable people. I'm not saying anything bad about the ministry. I'm not saying anything bad about the people. The position just didn't make sense anymore for a church in our shape. We had transcriptionists at First Baptist Church, people who got a full-time salary just to write out sermons that had been preached here. That's good, honest, faithful work. It made sense at one time. It didn't make sense anymore. These personnel changes are going to have to happen, and it is going to end relationships. This is the worst part for me. It's painful. Those relationships don't need to end. They shouldn't end in a world where everything is working the way it should, but they will end. It happens when leaders sin and don't lead the right way. It happens when staff sin and they expect you to use your relationship to protect them, and they begin to view you exclusively as either a help or a hindrance to their ambition. And if you help their ambition, they'll like you, and if you hinder it, they won't. As a leader, your job is to watch out for the whole church. You cannot play favorites. You cannot allow a whole ship to sink for a few people. And so to deal with this, first of all, you got to tell the truth. You've got to be as candid as you can be about the situation that you're facing and about the reasons why you're making the decisions you're going to make. This is good, but it might not help. We had a staff member at First Baptist Church who personally complained to me about some layoffs that happened in 2012, long before I got here. And they complained and they said, we didn't like the way it happened because the people who were here got called into a meeting. There was no warning, and they got called into a meeting and they were immediately cut off and they were removed off of church property, and it was too quick and there was no chance to take it in. They called it Black Tuesday. Well, I heard that and wanted to care for our staff, and so we announced in October of 2019 that layoffs were going to be coming in February of 2020. And I said, hey, we want to give you notice. We want to make you aware that these things are going to happen. We realize that some of you are going to take this notice to go take other jobs, and some of you are going to leave that we'd like to keep. But as an exercise in love and kindness, we feel like we need to make you aware at least of what we know right now. And so we gave warning. Well, the person who had complained about not having warning then complained to me that I gave them warning and that I had created a hostile work environment by making everybody afraid. The point is, I was trying to do the right thing. I was trying to communicate clearly and with expectations, but it didn't help. Why didn't it help? Because there's no great way to take someone's job away. There's no easy way to do that. But you should tell the truth. You should be as candid as you can be and tell the truth. You should also keep records. These people are going to get upset. We have kept very careful personnel records at First Baptist Church. There's been several situations where we actually have brought in outsiders to come in and try to mediate situations. And so there are even records kept from outside organizations and outside groups that can verify that people were treated well and fairly in spite of the criticisms that they sometimes level. You also need to be committed to relationship. You need to be committed to loving and caring for people well.
You need to be committed to this, even though every leader is going to do it imperfectly. You need to do it even though staff that hate you for taking away something they like might not be committed to relationship. You need to be committed to it. In fact, I will say that I have sought to make clear to every person who is upset with me, and there are a lot of them. I have sought to make clear that I love you, I want to care for you, and I want our relationship to be restored. That offer is ongoing and outstanding. Even if you're one of those people and you're hearing this now, my commitment to you right now is that there would be no relationship that is broken, but every relationship restored to a spirit of Christian love and charity. You've got to be committed to that, because the relationship that lasts into eternity, or the fact that we're brothers and sisters, this boss, staff, leader, follower dynamic will one day give way to an everlasting world where we love each other as brothers and sisters in Christ before the throne of grace. And so we need to prioritize that in our relationships. I've talked about the Titanic in this episode. I talked about that Titanic replica. That replica of the Titanic now hangs in my office. And one day, a local reporter from a television station here in Jacksonville was doing an interview with me in my office. And as the cameraman was setting up, he was looking around at the things hanging on my wall, and he said, "Why does a pastor have a replica of the Titanic in his office?" And I responded to him with 3 words. I said, "Big things sink." You need to remember that no matter how small, or no matter how large your ministry is, and the ministry of First Baptist Church was very large, big things sink. And they sink when you think it won't sink. Your ministry is going to change. Your ministry is going to have to change. The best response to this is slow, steady changes over time, slow adjustments, careful calculations to make the subtle adjustments that need to be made to keep your ministry current and faithful. The worst option is to let disaster strike, to hit the iceberg and sink to the bottom of the ocean. That is catastrophic change that you don't want to experience. There's another option. It's the option between slow, steady change and disastrous change that destroys the ministry. It's the option where you jerk the wheel to avoid disaster. You see the iceberg coming and you rip the ship in a different direction. I need to be honest with you and let you know that that is what I did at First Baptist.